Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here in Turkey talking about sustainability. And I think it's incredibly exciting to hear what a value has been placed on sustainability throughout the discussions today. I'm here to talk to you about green gastronomy and what role hospitality plays in building a world that is better for both people and the planet. So, hospitality, food. Food is one of the most hugely impactful elements of all of our lives. 330 million tons of meat and 815 million tons of dairy are produced globally each year, and they account for 60% of farming's total GHG emissions. It's nearly 20% of our total global emissions. That's more than travel. That's more than all of these other sectors in which we are talking about how to decarbonize. Just 10% of plastic products make up 75% of all, just 10 products make up 75% of all plastic pollution in our ocean. 6 of those items are related to food service. WWF predicts that by 2030, the volume of plastic in our oceans will outweigh the amount of fish. The UNEP found that 931 million tons of food is wasted, generated in 2019. 26% of that food waste comes from hospitality and food service. Suggests that 5% of global production of food is wasted in our industry alone. Farming uses 70% of the Earth's water. Energy costs make up almost a quarter of the overheads for a restaurant, and an estimated 10% of that is wasted in every restaurant. The UK, where I'm from, our restaurant sector consumes more than 1.3 billion pounds of energy each year and is responsible for higher carbon emissions than the entire country of Costa Rica. Hospitality is essentially ground zero for all of the issues that we are talking about that affect the people and the environment in which we live. It is ground zero for food waste. It's ground zero when we talk about health and nutrition. It's ground zero when we talk about water use, wastewater, energy use, litter, all of these things that plague our cities, that plague our kind of global vision for the future. Hospitality is a really good nexus and testing ground for seeing how those play out. But it's not just the operations of our sector that are highly impactful. Zoom out to include the full food system. And then you're talking about issues like climate justice. You're talking about issues like forced and child labor. You're talking about fair value distribution down the value chain, deforestation, pesticide use, modern slavery, emissions full stop in the transport of goods, biodiversity, antibiotic resistance. All of these things come to play in our industry. We have just experienced the most disruptive 2 years of our lives as a planet. Hospitality and food service and tourism, as all of us in this room will know, have experienced the greatest disruption of our services since the beginning of our sectors. And yet, these disruptive forces will continue to play a role in hospitality in the future because of the impact of climate change. So if you're looking at this chart, you obviously see that we've got these COVID-19 challenges on one side, but we also see the rise of these key challenges of business as usual, clean labels and sustainability, customers changing their buying patterns, the importance of data and how they manage it in restaurants, keeping on top of the changing consumer landscape. And none of this yet is talking about the fact that food, the rising cost of food, the rising cost of wildfires, of conflict, and all of that is deeply going to destabilize our industry. So we're at a crossroads as an industry. We're at a crossroads as a planet. We can see some headlines pulled from global media there. We talk all about how our food system isn't ready for the climate crisis, how we must galvanize, how we must build more energy behind sustainability. And it's so exciting to be sitting here today and hearing time after time people mention that we can't build a thriving tourism sector, gastro-tourism. We can't have a thriving gastro-economy unless we start thinking more holistically about sustainability. So can restaurants be a part of the solution instead of a part of the problem? I'm the managing director of an organization based in London that's called the Sustainable Restaurant Association. We run Food Made Good, which is the largest food service sustainability program in the world. We provide practical sustainability support to businesses that allows them to benchmark their performance, professionalize their approach, and then promote their success. One of the things that was mentioned earlier on this stage was the importance of that safe travel certification in reopening the tourism sector here in Turkey. Visualize that Food Made Good logo almost like a safe travel certification, but for sustainability across the industry. Imagine a world in which you, as a consumer, understood that when you were dining out, you were contributing towards positive forces, not towards negative ones. We increase awareness and credibility through industry partnerships. We work with people like the world's 50 best to ensure that sustainability is at the top of the agenda. Many of you might have seen the introduction of green Michelin stars. We've got the Coupe du Monde de Patisserie, which happens in France every year, is kind of like the World Cup for pastry, adding a sustainability criteria. We've got the San Pellegrino Young Chef Academy run in Milan, adding a sustainability criteria. All of a sudden, sustainability needs to underpin everything that we do in our sector. So, what are we talking about when we talk about sustainability? I think one of the hardest things about tackling these problems is that we throw around these big words and they don't necessarily mean the same things to the same people. So we at the Sustainable Restaurant Association set out to provide a framework that everybody can work towards and understand. Our framework is underpinned by the SDGs, but it's really focused on speaking directly to restaurants and hospitality. So we're talking about sourcing, the food that you put on your plate. We're talking about society, the way that you treat your people, both within the restaurant and within your wider communities. And then we're talking about environment and the environmental impact of a restaurant. As you can see, each one is then broken down into what that actually means for a restaurant, how you should be procuring and celebrating local and seasonal ingredients, serving more vegetables and better meat, sourcing your fish responsibly, supporting global farmers and importing goods throughout the value chain that add value to those that are producing your food. Treating staff fairly is an essential part of creating a hospitality sector globally that thrives. Most of us have experienced staff shortages post the pandemic, and most of us are needing to rethink, how do we incentivize young people to work in hospitality? How do we create energy and fair jobs and fair labor to ensure that people understand that working in restaurants is a good job? How can restaurants support the community, both through the goods that they purchase and through the way that they behave in their communities? Restaurants have such an opportunity as local employers. They have an opportunity as a bedrock in their community that engages with people coming in and out to be a part of that thriving local economy. How can restaurants feed people well? And what does that look like in the different contexts and different areas in which we feed people? So that doesn't necessarily mean that we need every Michelin-starred restaurant to serve diet-conscious food, but it does mean that we need to be thinking about the health of the humans that are coming in to dine with us. How do we value natural resources? Save energy, save water. We've heard throughout the symposium today that water is going to be an essential part of building our agricultural systems, and it's a scarce resource. Reducing those energy emissions and driving towards a net zero economy. There is no such thing as a global net zero economy that doesn't involve restaurants. How do we reduce, reuse, recycle, rethink all of the packaging that comes in and out of our restaurants every day? We've heard again about ghost kitchens, the rise of delivery, drone delivery. How do we make sure that we don't just move towards a food future that involves stacking up plastic takeaway boxes at the end of our dining tables at home? And how do we waste no food and move towards circular systems when we're thinking about the food that's coming in and out of our restaurants? We have a global community. You can find it at community.foodmadegood.org. The idea is, how do you bring people around the world together that are working in hospitality to ask and answer questions of each other? These challenges are happening all over the country. There's some really great practice out there, and there are some challenges that are really universal. So can we create a forum in which hospitality individuals can go on, ask questions, get advice, understand what they should do next? And I'll leave you with a few questions to provoke your thinking. What does circularity look like in a restaurant? I've got a great example here of some knives that were made in a restaurant in northeast London. The handles of those knives are made out of the plastic chopping boards that are used in restaurant kitchens. In most places, you can't get away from using that plastic board because of food safety legislation. And what happens is, over time, that plastic degrades. So they're melting down those plastic chopping boards and creating handles for their knives. What you have on this side they're called NOS cartridges, and they're used in East London almost like a drug, and it's a kind of gas cartridge that are littering our parks and our streets in parts of London. Those metal NOS cartridges were melted down and used by a local forager to forge the blade being used on the knife. So can restaurants rethink their circularity within them and use waste products in their community to turn it into a product of value that means something in their kitchen? What does a net zero restaurant look like? Now, this picture is put up to be a bit provocative. This was McDonald's claiming their first net zero location in the UK, but they're not thinking about the food. They're only talking about the design of the building, the energy consumption being used. In emissions language, they're only talking about scope 1 and scope 2. But the thing is, 90% of the impact of a restaurant has nothing to do with the building and has everything to do with the supply chain. So until you as a restaurant are ready to reconcile with your supply chain, you can't claim that we're getting to a net zero economy. And finally, how do we make sure that we feed people and not bins? Again, another kind of provocative image. This is a classic English breakfast from a very classic British pub chain who had done loads and loads of work behind the scenes at eliminating waste from their kitchens. But they refused to touch the plate because it was food being sold. Consumers had already paid for it. It wasn't the restaurant's problem. And yet, they were generating so much surplus waste. Almost 80% of the food waste being generated by the restaurant was happening from food uneaten on plates. And so they finally took responsibility and started realizing they needed to change their portion size. They needed to make the tomatoes, tomatoes in the UK are not the greatest tomatoes, have nothing on the tomatoes that you serve here in Turkey, and make the tomatoes an optional part of the breakfast so that they weren't being left behind. Saves them 8 million tomatoes every year. And finally, join the revolution. We want to get restaurants all around the world engaged in these concepts, engaged in sharing their ideas and pushing the industry further and faster forward. We've got a very simple survey online. That QR code should take you right there. It's called the Food Made Good 50, or 50 Ideas with Impact. Very simple, yes, no questions on things that you could do or implement in your restaurant, and from that get a sense of where you stand and where you should go next. And with that, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.